Whilst Premier League stadiums look like this, La Liga stadiums like this, and Bundesliga stadiums like this, most Serie A stadiums look something a bit more like this. That is the 43,147 capacity Stadio Artemio Franchi, home of 2-time Serie A and 6-time Coppa Italia winners Fiorentina. Designed by Pierluigi Nervi, the same architect who designed the Hall of Pontifical Audiences in the Vatican, the Stadio Artemio Franchi first opened in September 1931, which actually makes it one of the newer stadiums in Serie A. There is a certain charm and imposing rawness about Italian football stadiums, but that doesn't change the fact that they are the emptiest and by far the least profitable in Europe's Big Five leagues. In the Premier League's inaugural season exactly 30 years ago, the average attendance in English football's top flight was 21,130. The average attendance in Serie A that exact same season was 57,373, almost 3 times the Premier League's average, and it was even higher still, over 59,000, in the 1991-92 campaign. Within a decade of its inception, the Premier League had already overtaken Serie A in terms of attendances, with Premier League crowds having risen steadily to an average of 35,464, meanwhile Serie A attendances had plummeted to just 25,472. These days, the average attendance in Serie A is 28,945, up from 23,101 10 years ago, but still massively down from where they once were. Meanwhile, the Premier League now averages over 40,000, despite Brentford and Bournemouth's petite stadiums, shall we just say, bringing that average down. That is problematic for Serie A teams, both optically and financially. The appearance of Serie A stadiums, with hordes of empty seats outside of the biggest games and a handful of clubs, looks terrible on television and makes the league a much tougher product to sell than their rivals overseas. Financially, not only does fewer fans directly equal less revenue, the state of Italian football stadiums and their ownership structures means that those fans that do still attend games are much less lucrative and profitable than match-going fans in England, Germany or Spain. Factor in the loss of revenue from poor optics, resulting in less lucrative broadcast deals as well, and one could make a pretty decent case that Italian football's dark, damp, inhospitable, and in many cases crumbling stadiums is the primary cause of Italian football's demise over the last 2 to 3 decades. So why don't they just build new stadiums? Well, one team has done, namely the biggest club in Italian football, Juventus, and it has been a major success. But whilst the will is there to do likewise at other Italian clubs, making that a reality has proved to be much more difficult. So in today's video, I wanted to take a look at Italian football's decrepit old stadiums, many of which are increasingly beginning to resemble the Colosseum but with considerably less grandeur, why they are so bad, why it is such a colossal problem, and why it is proving so difficult to fix. It's been a rough few decades for Serie A. Almost universally regarded as the best league on the planet during the 1990s, the all-Italian 2003 Champions League final between AC Milan and Juventus felt like the end of an era. By that stage, the Premier League had already overtaken Serie A in terms of revenue, and 3 years later, Italian football was rocked by the Calciopoli scandal. Italy's biggest and most successful club, Juventus, were stripped of their 2004-05 and 2005-06 Scudettos, kicked out of the UEFA Champions League, and relegated to Serie B. Meanwhile, AC Milan, Fiorentina and Lazio were all deducted 30 points for the 2005-06 season and handed further points deductions, along with Regina, in the 2006-07 campaign. The Calciopoli scandal not only stripped Serie A of its biggest club, and therefore made it a much less attractive prospect for both fans and broadcasters alike, it also led to a lot of supporters simply becoming disillusioned with Italian football. Sport is built upon the premise of fairness, which is why any hint of corruption is so damaging. Many of those fans who became disillusioned with Italian football because of Calciopoli, which came in the midst of a broader malaise, have never returned. The following season, AC Milan won their 7th Champions League or European Cup, moving them to within 2 titles of the competition's most successful club, Real Madrid. In the 15 years since then, just one Italian club, Jose Mourinho's underdogs Inter Milan in 2009-10, have won the Champions League. And in the 12 years since that triumph, Juventus are the only Italian club to have reached the final of the competition, losing to Spanish giants Real Madrid and Barcelona in both 2015 and 2017. For many years, Italy's biggest clubs were bankrolled by the patriarchs of mega-rich Italian families. AC Milan had the Berlusconis, Inter Milan had the Maratis, and Juventus had the Agnellis. From the 1960s through to the 1990s, this ownership model suited Italian football very well. Italian football spent more money on players in terms of transfer fees and wages than any other league on the planet, while still only accounting for a fairly small percentage of their super-rich owners' net worths, which they deem to be a worthwhile investment for reasons of power, politics, and prestige. World football, and particularly European football, has changed a lot since the 1990s though. The advent of the Premier League was a game changer in terms of marketing and therefore both commercial and broadcast revenue, as football became commodified and commercialised to a degree that it never previously had. Italian football watched on at these developments, with an element of righteous and justified distaste, twinned with a misplaced arrogance about its status within the world, and a naivety as to how quickly that could all be lost. Now the team that finishes bottom of the Premier League table each season, and is therefore relegated to the Championship, still receives more money in terms of broadcast revenue than the team that wins the Serie A title each season. And being a single-digit billionaire is no longer enough to ensure that your club retains a seat at the top table of European football. Premier League clubs not only have wildly disproportionate broadcast revenue compared to the rest of Europe, there are only 2 Premier League teams now that aren't owned by billionaires. Meanwhile, Manchester City are effectively owned by the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, Newcastle United are owned by the State of Saudi Arabia, much as they would claim otherwise, and there are currently talks of a state-backed Qatari takeover of Manchester United. Elsewhere on the continent, the only teams consistently able to keep pace with the spending power of Premier League teams, and many of them with great difficulty it should be said, are PSG, also owned by the state of Qatar, Bayern Munich, who have effectively monopolised German football, and the Spanish giants of Real Madrid and Barcelona, the latter of whom having had to get quite creative in terms of their accounting just to make that possible. In light of this new reality, the Berlusconis and Maratis have sold up at AC and Inter Milan. Meanwhile, Juventus, less than 17 years on from Calciopoli, are currently facing a fresh scandal once again, have already been hit with a massive 15-point deduction this season, and longtime chairman Andrea Agnelli of the Agnelli family resigned along with the rest of the Juventus board in light of the club's latest scandal, replaced by Gianluca Ferrero in November 2022. When he sold AC Milan in 2017, Silvio Berlusconi told the club supporters, "In the modern game, to compete at the highest level in Europe and the world requires investment and resources a single family can no longer support." Given that the Berlusconi family is the 5th richest in Italy, with an estimated net worth of $7 billion, it was a telling admission from one of the most significant figures in Italian football. Berlusconi has since bought and appointed his brother as the chairman of nearby AC Monza, reflecting the level at which someone of his wealth now feels as though they are capable of operating at within European football. The seeds of Serie A's decline had already been sown long before Calciopoli, but 2006 was a particularly unusual year, even by the standards of Italian football. Fresh off the back of the scandal, Italy were written off by most observers heading into the 2006 World Cup. Italy had been dumped out in controversial circumstances by South Korea at the previous World Cup, with captain Paolo Maldini having retired following that disappointment. Meanwhile, Francesco Totti came into their squad injured, and there were some doubts about whether he would even be fit in time to feature. Totti did feature though, starring in all 7 of Italy's games as Marcello Lippi's men defied all expectations, going all the way and beating France on penalties in the final to claim their 4th World Cup crown. In the semi-finals, Italy won 2-0 after extra time against Germany in Dortmund. It was heartbreak for the hosts against their old foes, as the 5th time that they had faced Italy at the FIFA World Cup, and the 5th time that they had failed to beat them. But in many respects, whilst Italy took the glory in 2006, it was the Germans who had the last laugh. Germany utilised the 2006 World Cup to totally transform the nation's footballing infrastructure. 2 brand new stadiums were built, the Allianz Arena and the Zentralstadion. Meanwhile, 8 underwent major renovations, most notably of all the Olympiastadion, which put them on par with most brand new arenas. The 2 exceptions, in terms of World Cup venues, were the Veltins Arena, opened in 2001, and the Volkspark Stadion, which had already undergone major renovations in 1998. Of course, 16 years earlier, Italy had been handed the exact same opportunity when they were awarded World Cup hosting rights by FIFA in 1990. As with Germany, Italy built 2 brand new stadiums for the World Cup, the despised Stadio delle Alpi in Turin, which became the new home ground of both Juventus and Torino, and the utterly ridiculous Stadio San Nicola in Bari, which inevitably became the new home of SSC Bari. A further 10 underwent renovations of some kind or another, and it's not as though Italy hosted the World Cup on the cheap. A total of $4 billion was spent hosting the tournament, which is actually more than the $5.2 billion that Germany spent in 2006, once adjusted for inflation. In terms of what Italy and Germany got in exchange for that investment, however, there is really no comparison. 18 years on from when it first opened, the Allianz Arena remains a world-class state-of-the-art venue, which looks as though it could have been built in 2023, continues to generate among the most matchday revenue for Bayern Munich of any club in Europe, and will host several games, including one of the 2 semi-finals, at Euro 2024. Just 16 years after it opened, by comparison, the Stadio delle Alpi had been shut down, with both Juventus and Torino having moved out, and just 3 years after that, so 19 years after it was built at a cost of €200 million, it was entirely demolished. The Delle Alpi was hated by both Juventus and Torino fans alike. When the stadium first opened, Juventus owner Gianni Agnelli complained that you could barely see the game from the stands and that it was like playing every game away from home. It later transpired that the architect had never watched a game of football before in his life. Fans complained that not only were they far too far away from the pitch, the ground was inhospitable and unwelcoming, and that the drainage system was designed in such a way that it frequently flooded the pitch. The Stadio San Nicola, meanwhile, which I have talked about at length previously on this channel, is much less despised, but even more bizarre. Built at an exorbitant cost in the middle of nowhere, the Stadio San Nicola is about an hour's walk from the centre of Bari, which is itself only the 9th largest city in Italy. Meanwhile, SSC Bari were a perennial yo-yo club, whose previous home ground held fewer than 20,000 fans. 2 years after it opened, Bari were relegated once again. The Stadio San Nicola is absolutely enormous, capable of, but very rarely accommodating, 58,270 fans, which makes it the 4th largest stadium in Italy. Tired, outdated, and typically more than half empty, Bari decided in 2017, less than 30 years after it opened, that the San Nicola required between 120 to 150 million euros worth of renovations, which would reduce the capacity by 13,000. Unfortunately, a year later, in 2018, Bari were liquidated and forced to start out again in the 4th tier of Italian football as a Phoenix club, meaning that those plans never went ahead. There were minor renovations carried out in 2020 at a significantly lower cost, but they were nowhere near sufficient. The Stadio San Nicola is idiotic as a football stadium, but it is beautiful as a work of art, with its 26 petals looking particularly stunning when lit up on an evening. There are those who would argue, not entirely without merit I don't think, that the chaos and dysfunction of Italian football, summed up by something like the Stadio San Nicola, which is a near 60,000-seater Serie B stadium, is part of its magic and part of what makes it so captivating to those who adore it and not only didn't give up on it through its myriad of crises, but view them as part of its charm and appeal. The Premier League's newest stadiums, such as the Emirates, the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and the London Stadium, are hospitable but sanitised. No one could accuse the Stadio Orecchi in Salerno, or better still, the Stadio Castellani in Empoli, of being either of those things. There are two sides to every argument, and that is perhaps best summed up in the context of Italian football stadiums by the debate surrounding the possible demolition and replacement of the San Siro, which has been home to Inter Milan since 1947 and AC Milan, with only a 6-year exception, since 1926. To some, the San Siro is an integral part of the fabric and both the physical and emotional landscape of the city of Milan, and demolishing it would be like knocking down the Santa Maria delle Grazie or the city's famous cathedral. To others, including, most notably, the hierarchies at both Inter and AC Milan, the San Siro is outdated, inflexible, and unable to provide either club with the kind of revenues that they would need to compete with Europe's elite. The biggest issue with the San Siro, on that front, is not just that it is 97 years old. Old Trafford is technically older than that and remains extremely profitable. It is that it is so sorely lacking in corporate and hospitality facilities, which is where Europe's mega clubs now rake in serious cash. One would think that in a world of enormous television rights deals and selling merchandise around the globe, matchday revenue would be relatively insignificant to the world's biggest football clubs, but they would be badly wrong. Matchday revenue is worth more than €100 million a year to Arsenal, PSG, Manchester United, Tottenham Hotspur, Real Madrid, and Barcelona, and not much less than that to the likes of Liverpool, Bayern Munich, and Chelsea. For most of these clubs, that is between a quarter and a fifth of their revenue, whilst also boosting commercial profits, hence why the COVID-19 pandemic was so disastrous for a lot of clubs, particularly those who were more dependent upon matchday income. In the words of George Orwell, though, not all football fans are created equal. Bayern Munich are renowned for their affordable season tickets, but you don't rake in £70 million plus a season without someone coughing up some serious change. And at Bayern, as with most clubs, it is those sat in the posh seats who do just that. When Juventus, who are the one major Italian club to have built their own stadium in recent years, left the 69,000 capacity Stadio delle Alpi behind in 2006, they built a stadium which could only hold 41,507 fans. That is a decrease of 27,493, or one whole Carrow Road, which you might have thought would damage their revenue, but Juventus increased their corporate offering and saw an enormous 282% increase in their matchday revenue. Juventus have raked in an additional €15 million plus a season since moving into the Juventus or Allianz Stadium, with the exception of the COVID years, of course, which puts them in a league of their own given the rest of the league's circumstances, and played a huge role in their prolonged period of relentless success following the move in 2011. The capacity of 41,507 has long been questioned given Juventus's enormous domestic and international fan base, but the club has remained steadfast in its belief that it is the perfect size, ensuring that the stadium is almost always entirely full and creating a much better atmosphere with fans feeling on top of the players and close to the action. A feeling of fans being too far from the pitch was one of the biggest issues not just with the Delle Alpi, leading to its swift demolition, but with so many Italian football stadiums. That is partly because when Italy ploughed $4 billion into hosting the World Cup in 1990, Primo Nebbiolo, who was the Italian head of the International Association of Athletics Federations at the time, made the case that if the state was to throw so much money at hosting a football tournament, the new or renovated venues should at least be able to accommodate athletics as well. It might seem like a reasonable argument on the face of it, but in Italy, as with most of Europe, football is pretty much the only sport capable of consistently filling, or even coming close to filling, massive stadiums every week. By putting an athletics track around a football pitch, you push fans further away from the pitch, giving them a worse view and the ground a worse atmosphere, which is largely pointless if you never need a stadium that large to host athletics events in the first place. We saw here in England, with the case of the 2012 Olympic Stadium in London, just how difficult and expensive it is to convert an athletics stadium into a purpose-built football stadium, and the issues with supporters that can entail. The UK had that problem with one, admittedly, very expensive stadium. Italy has it with several. Another thing that is worth adding is that, for all of Italy and Italian football's faults in terms of planning and design, particularly in relation to Italia 90, and believe me, they are plentiful, there were some pitfalls that were somewhat out of their control. The 1990s, for example, was just a period of rapid modernisation in terms of how stadiums were designed and built. The Stadio delle Alpi and the Stadio San Nicola might have seemed modern in 1990, but before the decade was done, the likes of the Amsterdam Arena, now the Johan Cruyff Arena, and the Stade de France, which could pass as being brand new stadiums now, had already put them to shame. The Taylor Report in England, published at the beginning of the 1990s into the causes of the Hillsborough disaster, forced clubs to rapidly modernise their grounds, and in many cases, to build new ones entirely. That was opposed by a lot of football clubs at the time, given the cost that they were forced to incur, but it made stadiums safer, more hospitable, and much more family-friendly, leading to better venues, better crowds, and therefore higher revenues for clubs in the long term. In an example of how, in some cases, regulation can actually force businesses to take a longer-term outlook and lead to greater economic growth. It wasn't just that when Juventus moved to their own ground in 2011 that they were able to flog a load of posh seats to Turin's Prawn Sandwich Brigade, though that did certainly help. It was that they actually moved to their own ground, with an emphasis on the word own there. The vast majority of Italian clubs, with only a few exceptions, don't own their own stadiums. Instead, most stadiums are owned by the local council and municipalities and are leased out to the clubs who occupy them and who therefore have to pay rent. Owning your own stadium not only allows a club to make internal and external renovations as and when they see fit and according to their own circumstances, rather than at the whims of the local municipality, or, in most cases, just never at all, without having to pay rent and whilst retaining 100% of their matchday revenue. It also gives clubs the ability to sell the naming rights for their ground, often for very lucrative sums, build things like a museum, superstore, and hotel on the same site, all of which Juventus have done, and to earn revenue through non-football related events. Just take a look at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, which since opening in 2019 has played host to major boxing events, NFL games, both rugby league and rugby union, and concerts by Guns N' Roses, Lady Gaga, and soon Beyoncé. Sure, Tottenham still won't win anything, but that's a major cash cow for the club. Sorry, Spurs fans, that was totally uncalled for. Whilst it was once the case that Italian football looked at stadiums like the Emirates and the Allianz Arena being built with a sense of ignorance of the fact that Italian football was being left in the dust by their peers, there is now a consensus that change is required, and either new stadiums need to be built or existing stadiums majorly renovated. So, problem solved. It's only a matter of time before we see a load of brand spanking new state-of-the-art stadiums in Italy, bringing them in line with the Premier League and the Bundesliga, and owned by the clubs themselves, thus increasing their earning potential, match day, and subsequently both broadcast and commercial revenue, and re-establishing Serie A as a dominant force in European football once again. Right? Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. In football, as in almost everything else, money begets money, meanwhile bad decisions often create a vicious cycle. Poor planning means Serie A revenues, relatively speaking, are low, meanwhile building a state-of-the-art football stadium tends not to come cheap. What's more, Italy is famous for its bureaucracy and backwards planning regulations. According to research, while stadiums across most of Europe take between 2 to 3 years to be built, from planning to completion, that average rises to between 8 to 10 years in Italy. Roma's planned new stadium, the Stadio della Roma, was halted and effectively aborted in February 2021, a whopping 3,313 days after it was first announced. With so much dependency upon local municipalities agreeing to projects and helping to facilitate them, plans that have been years in the making can sometimes be scuppered by something as simple as the election of a new mayor, which was the case with Roma, among several other issues it must be said. The same issue, in terms of bureaucracy, a lack of forward thinking, and in many instances either outright or something that strongly resembles corruption, means that Italy's public transport often lags behind its continental counterparts on that front, which is another issue for football clubs and attendances due to the difficulty of getting to and from games. And then you add to all of those issues the fact that over the last 12 months, it has become much more expensive to borrow money, something which any Italian football club is going to have to do in order to build their own ground. I like to end these videos on a positive note, and I suppose the positive is that Italian clubs have finally realised, over the last decade, that radical reform is required. There are now 5 Serie A clubs with American owners, including Atalanta, AC Milan and Roma, and a further 3 in Serie B. A lot of American private equity firms are of the view that European football is a great product, their word, not mine, but that Europeans are basically rubbish at marketing. Nowhere is that more true than in Serie A, whose overseas TV rights deal for the current 3-year cycle, from 2021 to 2024, is worth €670 million, compared to the Premier League's 3-year deal from 2022 to 2025, which is worth €6.55 billion. Former Serie A president Paolo Del Pino had promised to rectify that imbalance with some bold ideas, but he resigned in February 2022 to relocate his family permanently to California. As he headed stateside, plenty of Americans have made the opposite journey, seeing the opportunity to pick up clubs on the cheap, increase revenues both individually and as a collective, and to make out like bandits. Whether they will be able to do that still remains to be seen, and there are plenty of positive signs for Italian football outside of the stadium problem. For the first time since the 2005-06 season, there are 3 teams in this season's UEFA Champions League quarter-finals. AC Milan being drawn against Napoli also means that there is guaranteed to be at least one Italian team in the semi-finals, and if Inter Milan are able to overcome Benfica, there will be another all-Italian tie in the semis, carrying the guarantee of an Italian finalist for the first time in 6 years. There's every reason to believe that Serie A's new owners and administrators will professionalise certain aspects of the league and maximise commercial avenues open to them, but it is hard to find too many positives to end on from a stadium perspective, which is, after all, the entire subject of this video. On that front, progress is slow, and by slow, in most cases, I mean non-existent. Problems in terms of planning, bureaucracy, and cost all persist, and as long as that remains the case, Italy will be a great place to go and see what it was like to watch a football match 30 to 50 years ago, but Italian teams will face a monumental challenge, attempting to repeat their success in the Champions League this season on a consistent basis. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, both for this channel and my second channel, both of which should be on your screens now. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.